Welcome to the 270th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Isla Morley, author of the new novel, The Last Blue. Stay tuned for the interview. This episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast is brought to you by Libro.fm. Libro.fm is the first and only company which lets you purchase audiobooks directly from your favorite local bookstore. Support your favorite local bookstore, and you can pick from more than 125,000 audiobooks, including New York Times bestsellers and recommendations from booksellers. You'll get the same audiobooks at the same price as the largest audiobook company out there. You know who I'm talking about, but you'll be part of a different story, one that supports your local bookstore. If you're new to audiobooks, they're the perfect way to get more books into your busy life. If you already love audiobooks and don't know what to listen to next, check out the recommendations and curated list from the people who know audiobooks best, your local bookseller. There's a special offer now for Reading and Writing Podcast listeners. Get 3 audiobooks for the price of one, $14.99, with your first month of membership. Just use the code RWPodcast. Again, that's Libro.fm, purchasing audiobooks from your local bookstore, and use the code RWPodcast. Stay tuned for my interview with Isla Morley. First, we have an excerpt from the audiobook of The Last Blue by Isla Morley, published by Recorded Books and narrated by T. Ryder Smith, available wherever audiobooks are sold.
35 years ago, Havens would have opened his eyes and thought of the day ahead as lacking. The surprise of old age is how comfortable a person can be with an empty day, how companionable it can be. If anything, Havens wants the day to empty itself even more, allow for memories to pay a visit. And should he decide to spend his time doing nothing more than sitting in his recliner and missing her, what's to stop him? Havens is neither by nature nor by habit an early riser, and it is only out of a sense of duty to an imperious old pigeon that he gets up rather than turn over and doze a little longer. When he stretches his arms overhead and arches his back, his joints creak in protest. He looks in the mirror at a face that seems both familiar and startlingly foreign. Old age is a menace. There's no abating it. Every day it claims more territory. Foregoing shaving, he splashes water on his face and puts on exactly what he wore yesterday. A pair of saggy jeans, his red flannel shirt, a coffee-stained gray pullover, and sneakers mended at the toe with packaging tape, and humming tunelessly wanders through the quiet house. He glances out the living-room window at the pasture, pillowy with fog. The day, too, seems to be getting a late start. Havens would prefer to drink a cup of coffee before facing the pigeon, but the chirps coming from the enclosed back porch are insistent, so he leaves the coffee to boil on the stove and goes out to take his instruction. "What are you in such a flap about?" He notices the bird has worked loose the bandaging on his wing, and the joint is exposed again at the break. "You've picked yourself raw, silly." He removes the top of Lord Byron's cage and slides the window open so the pigeon can enjoy the brisk air. Fluffed up, the bird hops onto the windowsill, gives in to instinct, and plummets. 8 months convalescing, and still the bird refuses to accept his decrepitude. Havens respects this in any being, feathered or otherwise. He rushes outside to retrieve the bird before applying ointment, bandaging the wound, and getting his hands pecked at in return. "Quit it, would you? Violence is never the answer." The bird knows Havens is a pushover. He tips over the seed tray as if to say, "Slop."
Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Isla Morley, author of the new novel, The Last Blue. Isla, welcome back to the podcast.
So good to be here, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about your new novel, The Last Blue, yet, can you describe the novel?
It's a historical fiction. It's about a mysterious woman with blue skin who's been living a banished life with her family deep in the wilderness of eastern Kentucky, in that part of the Appalachian wilderness. She's been the subject of prejudice and bullying, and in order to stay alive, she and her family live very remotely from the nearby town, a fictional town called Chance, which is kind of loosely based on Harlan. And she's trying to come to terms with her existence as a person who's been self-isolating all these years, and what that means to her for the rest of her life, until a photographer and a journalist are dispatched from Cincinnati, Ohio. They work for President Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration, and they've been tasked to go to that area and capture the struggles of the people that are living in that region. And there was little known at the time in the 1930s about that region. And so here are these two field reporters, and the photographer is desperate to kind of secure a future for his failing career as a photographer. And so, desperate for a story, a headline story, a scoop even, they hear about the blue people living up in this hollow. And of course, they can't resist what that might mean. And so they take off after a headline story.
And so do you remember the original idea that led you to write The Last Blue?
I sure do. So, I was busy working on my previous novel that we had talked about above. And I was doing a rewrite, which means I get bored and look for ways to distract myself. So I was on the internet, and one of the things that popped up in my news feed was really startling. It was just this picture. It looked like an old daguerreotype photograph of a family. It was a family portrait kind of set out in front of their old cabin, a very old-timey looking setting. And half of the children in this portrait of 9 people were blue. And I just thought, oh, this has to be a hoax. This is like the National Enquirer, where baby's born with an alligator head or something. I just thought, oh, this just can't be true. But yeah, if you want to know who that person is, that responds to clickbait, that would be me. So I clicked on it, and then I thought, oh, okay, so I was right. You see, it is a hoax, because it wasn't actually a photograph, it was a painting. But I kept clicking, and then I found out that that painting had been commissioned to accompany an actual essay, an article that had been written and published in a scientific magazine in 1982. Kathy Trost was the author of that 5-page article, and it was called The Blue People of Troublesome Creek. And in it, she gave the history of these people that were living in this area, stretching back to, about 160 years, like the 1800 something, and to this chap called Martin Fugit, who was a French orphan. He was a stowaway. He came to the United States and eventually found his way to Eastern Kentucky and settled on the banks of Troublesome Creek. He himself was not blue, and against astronomical odds, he ended up marrying this woman who, unknown to everyone, carried the same recessive gene that he was carrying, that when together they started having a family, their children started coming out blue. So this story just grabbed my attention, but really it was the paragraph right near the end. It was a couple of sentences. This journalist has been interviewing the hematologist that was involved in first diagnosing these people. Journalists have been interviewing descendants of the blue people. So in one of these exchanges, this guy called Stacy is being interviewed by a journalist, and he's talking about having lived in that area, and yes, he was married to this Luna woman that other people had said, she's just as blue as anything, like blue as a bruised plum. And he's talking about their life together, and he's beckoning to the grave site where she's buried nearby, and all this. But when it comes time to answer the journalist's question as to whether she was actually blue, he just point blank refuses. And then the article goes on, but I was just stuck with that image of this man sitting there being asked about his wife having blue skin, and him just being tight-lipped about that. And it got me to thinking about how love works, and when we love one another, what we're blind to, or maybe not what we're blind to, but what really doesn't matter at the end of the day. And I knew then that I wanted to write a love story about two people, very different backgrounds, who looked very different, who had different futures before them, then who meet and try and find common ground.
Interesting. So you mentioned earlier that this is a historical novel. What kind of research did you end up doing for The Last Blue?
Yeah, I haven't written historical fiction before, so this was kind of fun. It had a lot of research. Fortunately, the Library of Congress, is this gold mine, because that era was so heavily documented by these photojournalists, by these field reporters that worked for the WPA. There's just all these photographs. There are audio recordings in the Library of Congress where you hear these ancient voices speaking to us from the past. It might be a guy behind his mule in the field, and field reporters asking him who he votes for and what is his religious affiliation and what does he think of the schooling. So, in terms of getting a really good flavor for that era, the 1930s, and particularly that region. So I mentioned that there was very little known up until that point. But, 20 years before that, there would be some kind of musician or songwriter that would go down to the region, and they would, secretly record these people singing or playing their banjo or whatever, and then they would go back to Nashville and they'd cut a record. So you had people like that. You had people coming down from New York who were very interested in the crafts that these people were making. So they'd buy up all the banjos or the dulcimers or whatever, and then they go to New York and have this big exhibit and sell all these things. But apart from that, there were just all these stereotypes, and a lot of them exist to this day. We think of Hatfield and McCoys, and you think about moonshine and hillbillies and snake handlers and all of that. That just kind of governs our thinking still to this day. But when you go into the research, you find, a much more nuanced and complex and rich portrait of many different types of people that lived in that area, what drew them there, and what their struggles were. And the research was fascinating, but as always, when you do a lot of research, you have to be careful. That has to kind of seed the ground. You can't make that research show in your story.
So what is your writing process like? I mean, you just talked about your research. Do you outline and plan your novels extensively first, or do you write more organically? How does that work for you?
Oh gosh. Okay, I've written 4 books. The one book that I outlined because I thought I had such a good idea, the one book that I did that fancy thing on a yellow pad where I knew everything was going to go here and how that book never saw the light of day. My agent turned thumbs down and it didn't work for me. So I have that process that's much more frustrating. It takes a lot longer. It's here's an idea. Let me close my eyes and see what the imagination presents. So as a result, my books take several years to write. This one took me 5 years to write, but the wonderful thing about doing it this way is that I end up being surprised. I don't know where the story is going, and the kind of emotional responses I have to these imaginings and these plot twists that reveal themselves end up showing on the page. If I'm surprised, my reader's going to be surprised.
And so have you started thinking about or working on your next novel yet?
Okay, do you have a whip or something? Are you like one of those slave driver people? I do. I have 2 ideas. So, and one of them is an idea that's also based on real life. I quite like this idea. The blue people. To draw on the fact that they really existed. Just felt so wonderful to me. So now I've got this other story that is related to actually my family, going back a few generations. I have a great uncle who was the attorney who represented Ho Chi Minh when he was incarcerated in Hong Kong, and he was going to be executed. And it was my relative who took the case pro bono and got him off. So and then his brother was also a lawyer in England, and he defended the last quote unquote witch in the Second World War. So I don't know. I think that there's a story there.
Sounds interesting. So we'll wait for those. Given your experience now writing 4 novels, including the one that you said that you outlined and your agent did thumbs down, I'm curious, what advice would you have for aspiring writers who may be listening and are writing their own stories or novels?
I'd say start with a compelling idea. The thing that the little worm inside your head, that's where you start. And it doesn't have to start at the beginning, but start with the thing that grabs your interest and follow that. I'd say that what's essential for my books and for the books I enjoy reading is an interesting character. So I'd say that the focus would have to be on that primary character, and the objective to explore that character's complexity. So with those 2 things, I think plot will flow organically.
Great. What books, fiction or nonfiction, have you read recently that made an impression on you and that you would recommend?
Well, let me tell you what's been on my bedside table for over a year. It's this big, thick book called Behave by Robert Sapolsky. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I haven't.
The biology of humans at our best and our worst. This is just a fascinating read. It's kind of wonky, but there's so much humor and so much depth that gives a very rounded understanding of human nature. I'm into that stuff, but also I think just as a writer, to understand human motivation and where that germinates from is really interesting. So that's one book I recommend. I've yet to finish it. But then I'm reading an essay it was edited by Daniel Jones, who oversees the Modern Love column in the New York Times. I've just enjoyed those essays so much. And then Anne Patchett wrote another collection of essays, and I don't know why I didn't read it when it first came out. It's called This is a Story of a Happy Marriage. She's just a brilliant writer, and I particularly like her nonfiction work. And then my all-time favorite author is Alice Munro. She's Canadian. She's just a distinguished writer. I'm busy reading Hateship, Friendship, Courtship, Loveship, Marriage. And her other one that I so enjoyed was Dear Life. So those are some recommendations I have. Everything by Joan Didion I read. I'm also starting to read Colson Whitehead. I know I'm late to that party, but I'm busy reading Zone 1. So that's a little sampling of my reading smorgasbord.
Great. Well, where can people find you online if they'd like to learn more about you and your books?
islamorley.com. You can go to Pegasus Books and look under my name. Also, I'm on Facebook by my name, Isla Morley. You can find me on Instagram. My handle is @BlueBoots. That's BLUBOOTZ. I do a lot of kind of interesting stuff for writers on that. And I'm on Twitter @Isla Morley.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Isla Morley, author of the new novel, The Last Blue. Go grab a copy of the novel now. And Isla, thanks for doing this interview.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me. All the best to you.
Great.
Hello, Discover here to explain our cash back match. Here's how it works. We give you cash back for using your Discover card on the things you were going to buy anyway. Then we match that cash back in your first year. And that's why we call it Cashback Match. Now to recap and say cashback one more time. We match all the cash back you've earned at the end of your first year automatically. Discover. Exceptionally common sense. Learn more at discover.com/match. Limitations apply.
The holidays are doubly important this year, so make your celebrations doubly special. At Kroger, we've got a huge selection of high-quality meats on top of fresh, natural produce, like fresh, never-frozen prime-grade beef and our Simple Truth Organic Brussels sprouts, or delicious king crab legs with our private selection gourmet potatoes. Whew, had to say that doubly fast. Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Get more ways to save at the Buy 5 or More Save $1 each sale. Just buy 5 or more participating items and save $1 each with card. Kroger, fresh for everyone.